Welcome to Carney Conversations. This is an opportunity to hear from leading experts and their opinions on topics of major current interest in brain science. I am Diane Lipscombe, the director of the Carney Institute for Brain Science here at Brown, and also professor of neuroscience. And I'm joined by my colleague, Chris Moore, associate director of the Carney Institute, and also professor of neuroscience. And Chris and I are in conversation today with an expert, Dr. Diane Luna. The title of today's conversation is, What Are They Thinking? Decision-Making and the Adolescent Brain. Dr. Diane Luna is the Staunton Professor of Pediatrics and Psychiatry and Professor of Psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. Bea is a past recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers and a Fellow of the World Innovation Foundation. And fortunate for us, Bea is a scientific advisor to the Carney Institute at Brown. Bea is an expert on the adolescent brain and cognitive development, focusing on mechanisms that underlie transitions from child and adolescent to adult-level cognitive control and processing. Bea also studies substance abuse disorders, exploring the reward system, which is especially vulnerable to the disruption with lasting consequences in the teen brain. Bea's research and deep understanding of adolescent neurocognitive development has helped to inform the US Supreme Court on sentencing in the juvenile justice system. So now I'm going to pass over the microphone to Chris Moore, who's going to start in conversation with Bea. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Dan. And welcome, everyone, and welcome, Bea. Thanks so much for joining us in this conversation. I have to say, you've shown a tremendous amount of courage, Bea, in taking on scientifically the one group whose cognitive landscape I think terrifies most of us, the adolescent. Can you give us just a little back? How did you get into studying this incredibly complex and fascinating topic? What was your trajectory in getting to that kind of work?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's always great to be put in the hot seat to justify the type of work that I do and it's relevant. So actually, I started as a graduate student looking at the effects of prematurity in the brain and cognition. And one of the most striking findings was that regardless of the size or location of the lesion, they could not predict behavior. And it became quite evident to me that structural integrity was not sufficient, but we needed to look at functional integrity of the brain when you're looking at a highly plastic developing system. So I did a lot of work in that area. And then fMRI was starting to emerge. And I did my postdoctoral fellowship with John Sweeney here in Pittsburgh and in the psychiatric department, in the psychiatry department. And there, they were very interested in my knowledge of development. And they were very intrigued by the fact that psychopathology primarily emerges during the adolescent period. And fMRI was starting to emerge. It was not available for pediatric populations, but I had already proposed that that should be the case in my dissertation. So I became very interested in starting to examine neuroimaging and trying to see how we could make it something that we could apply to the pediatric population. So this was an opportunity to, bring together my interest in developmental questions and plasticity, but now to the adolescent period. And in fact, adolescence was a very important part of my life. I think most people have a good memory of that period. And I do remember being 15 and reading about a PET study and being blown away by the fact that one could actually look at how the brain functioned, and being very cognizant that I was living a finite period of my life, adolescence, where I was never going to be smarter more confident, and really feeling like I was living life. So it became very interesting to me, this ability to go and probe what was happening during the adolescent period.
That's awesome. Thank you. So one of the themes in my understanding, but fill us in, is that brains don't mature until much later than we thought they did. And the adolescent brain, when you're 13, you're sure that you're smarter than everyone, so your brain must be fully mature. As you were just pointing out, right? You're confident that you, but actually, brain development is going on into the mid-20s is the number I always hear tossed around in terms of how the frontal cortex is getting wired. Can you unpack this? Like when I think about teenage brains not being developed, I think of incredibly complex things teenagers are capable of scheming up as they're trying to make devious plans or great plans, but you know what I mean. Can you unpack what it is to be an adolescent brain then?
No, absolutely. So obviously that's what I've been studying for the last 20 years. And the model that has been emerging is that previous to adolescence, brain maturation is following an overall plan of accumulation. You're learning how to walk, you're learning how to talk, your brain is actually getting bigger. But by the time that you reach adolescence, everything is already there, even more so. And then you are shifting in adolescence to a period of specialization. It's the brain saying, okay, here you go. We've given you everything that you need. You've had a lot of time to exercise what you already came with. Now there are neural mechanisms that are going to motivate you and help you to specialize and define your adult trajectory. And further, I mean, one way that we've been thinking about it is that you are born with a particular psychobiological genetic template. That's what we call your ID card. And you're put in a particular environment. And these two, in the beginning, are really learning how to mold one another, how to, specialize and fit. And by the time that you reach adolescence is a time when there's this shift and you start to see many indices of specialization. So one very well-known one is synaptic pruning. So you have, neurons talk to one another, they make connections, and in the beginning of development, those are multiplied, and then you start to lose them and lose them and lose them. And that's a great thing. It's not a bad thing. You think, oh, I'm losing brain. It's a great thing because it works in a Hebbian process of use it or lose it. And it's a way for the brain to be adapting itself until these markers of closing critical periplasticity, solidify what your trajectory is going to be. So the adolescent is in this period and where everything has been given to them. And you mentioned frontal cortex, and there is a very popular view that adolescents do not have access to their prefrontal cortex. There are a lot of comics that have come up even in the Sunday papers. One of the insurance companies has a brain with like a missing prefrontal cortex during adolescence. And if there's anything that I want people to take from this, is that that is not what we have been finding. And it is in fact extremely telling of adolescence, and it's what helped me inform the Supreme Court briefs. And that is that we actually find abundant evidence that by adolescence, they have the ability to engage these executive prefrontal systems that allow us to have goal-driven behavior, to have abstract reasoning, to do complex planning. That is available by adolescence. It's new, they're learning how to use it. It's not connected to its most optimal level, but it has a lot of implications, and it helps us understand the behaviors that we see in adolescence. And I can go and talk for hours, but I'll let you ask me more specific questions.
So well then help me. If they've got access to this powerful machinery, if anything, maybe exuberant, just to be simplistic about it, kind of access, why is it that we associate the teenage brain with judgments we would not make at other times in our lives? In other words, if they've got this powerful, engine of discretion and cognitive control, or maybe not control, but specificity, why is it that they seem to make judgments that wouldn't be what what a grown-up would make?
No, that's really at the core of adolescence. So yes, you have access to these cognitive systems, but this is also a time that both animal studies and human studies have found that the brain systems that support motivation and reward-driven behavior is operating at a much higher level. So you get this relative, I don't want to say imbalance, because I don't think that the adolescent brain is broken or diseased. It's actually amazing. And during this time, you have an influx of, for example, aspects of neurotransmitters like the dopamine neurotransmitter that is involved in reward processing that seems to be operating at a much higher level. And we have found evidence for that in humans. There's a lot of rodent work and some non-human primate work that shows this as well. And what happens is that this is motivating the individual with their newly gained ability to have executive function to, start using this executive function to guide their decision making. I have this this silly example that I think I've told you, Chris, about. Because I know that this is, we're talking to the general public as well. So you can imagine a child walking with his mother down the street, and the child says, "Mom, look at that rooftop. Wouldn't it be nice to use my skateboard and go down that rooftop?" And mom says, "No, absolutely not. That would be terrible. You're not going to do it." And that's the end of the story. A teenager walks down the street with his friends and they go, "Hey man, look at that rooftop. Wow, we could totally go down that skateboard." And then the cognition starts up. "Hey, call Sally, call Janet, call Johnny, bring a ladder, make sure that somebody videotapes it for YouTube." And they actually make it happen. So it's that combination of heightened enthusiasm to try new experiences with this new machinery, and is in fact what the brain needs in order to really specialize. The brain needs to gain new experiences independent from parents. If there's parents out there, it's not bad that they want to gain their own experiences on their own. This is critical for them to start then to form who they're going to be as adults. Of course, there are good experiences and bad experiences, and we can talk about that as well.
Actually links to a couple of questions that have come in actually very beautifully around asking about your opinion with regard to is cognitive development more a matter of nurture or nature? So related question, what kind of developmental or learning activities are most helpful in terms of the developing brain and the adult cognitive power in teenagers. So I think those two are somewhat connected, but perhaps take on the first question: how much is innate and how much is nurture in terms of cognitive development?
Well, as you know, Diane, everything is both.
Yes, I
know. But I think that's actually a very, very good question, because there is a debate. How much can you push the system? Can you train first graders to have cognitive control? And what would be the implication of doing that? And my opinion, based on the work that I have done, is that there are chronologically determined aspects of brain development that are occurring that set some limits, rightfully so, as to how much you can push the system. And there is a time, for example, in adolescence, which has a lot of other aspects to it. you are mostly fully grown body-wise. So you can walk, you can go on your own and do things that when you're younger, you would not be able to do, correct? And, you know, you have hormonal changes that are really driving you to do certain things. And that enables you to have a higher level of cognitive engagement. Now, that said, like I said before, the system is specializing in a use it or lose it fashion. So we believe that there is room for some cognitive training to have an impact in trajectories. So much so that one of our bigger aims is to establish a pediatric growth chart, you know, like when you take your child and they tell you that their height is 70th percentile, but to probe cognition. And if you see a child is starting to fall in cognition, not because we care about them having excellent cognitive control, but because we know that what is supporting executive function and cognitive control is the highest level of distributed and integrated brain function, that it's very much related to psychiatric disorders. So if we see that there is a falling of this ability, there is discussions that we think that that could be trained to get someone back on track, so that that circuitry, like a muscle, the more that you use it, the more that the brain starts to appreciate, oh, so this is a circuitry that we really need to solidify through mechanisms like myelination, etc. And these other ones, not so much. So there is, you know, some wiggle room for the influences that nurture can have on the foundational aspects of nature.
Yeah. One thing I'm struck by, I think we all play the game of trying to think back, if we can remember that far, to being adolescents and kids, of course. And one thing I'm struck by as a parent now is the number of expectations on kids is so much greater in terms of what's expected in a classroom, or what's expected in terms of even, I don't know, manners at the table, right? Or the sort of norms about things like that. And then at the same time, there's a lot of evidence that in a lot of communities, kids have a lot less license to go ride their bike anywhere until they're much older, right? So there is a kind of way in which we almost prevent kids from doing the things they need to do as teenagers, but we expect them to act as adults at a much earlier age. This is a very provincial point of view from a parent, but I kind of wonder what those pressures might have on the kind of adults we're creating with that sort of different set of expectations and experiences.
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are a couple of ways that I think about it. There are things that change continuously. And I always like to think of it as evolution. And that, you know, kids do not know what is a lot of expectation or not. They are just dealing with what is given to them. Obviously, there are lines that you don't want to cross, you know, when it reaches a level of stress. And stress can also be defined in a certain way, right? A little bit of stress is good. Once you reach a certain higher level, then it can be counterproductive, and it can, you know, kind of like shut down the system. So it's a fine line that needs to be attended to. I mean, I often get a lot of questions about social media, which I'm sure people would ask at some point. What's with that social media? What's it going to do to, you know, the young brain? They're always on their phone. Believe me, it drives me crazy. I have adult children and I see that happening. But again, I think that what's amazing about the human species is its adaptability and flexibility. If this is a new thing, the brain knows to adapt to it. And, you know, especially now during COVID, I'm involved in many big nationwide projects and so forth, and we're trying to look at the impact of this social isolation and so forth. And in my view has been, I wonder if the youth is benefiting from the fact that they really have established a social media presence so that they will feel less isolated than perhaps us adults who are maybe not as adept or inclined to be, into the social media. So I don't know if that answers your question, Chris, but there is a threshold for stress, but I do think that the demands are always changing, through history, and we adapt.
We often talk about that, we're basically what we experience, and we're experiencing new things every minute of every day. So how much, when you think about what that actually means in terms of the changes that are occurring in the neural networks that are, at some level anyway, defining our behavior, is it a big change? I mean, do you think, every experience is producing some modification at a structural level, at the level of neural networks?
So this is a great story. I've been looking at brain networks for a while. And I remember the first analysis that a great grad student of mine, Kai Huang, did. He came to my office discouraged, saying, I've tried everything and I'm not seeing any changes to the hub connectivity in the brain. I am so sorry. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This is an amazing finding. And subsequent to, and this, we've published that, and then we've looked, at using graph theory, at the organization of brain networks, use Bayesian statistics to test the null hypothesis. And I find that it's a beautiful finding that the skeleton, that the foundational architecture of the brain is so intact very early in development. I mean, in our studies, we see it intact by 8, but there's also evidence of even, at the newborn stage, that there's this foundational aspect of the brain. I like to call it as having arms and legs. It's there, this amazing, intricate machinery is very much there. What we see is changing with development, and again, with that idea of refinement and specialization, is how different networks talk to one another. And that could be influenced by experience. So that we see the cognitive networks having increased integration with sensory networks, sensory motor networks, limbic networks, as time goes by. And I think within that space, experience is affecting it. But the actual foundation, even with psychiatric disorders, and we published this even with psychosis, which is such a serious psychopathology, that foundational skeleton of the neural network is very much intact. So, it's great to know that we have that, but that there's still room for plasticity.
So are you suggesting that strength of connection is something that would be a readout of an experience and a modification that you're measuring, or is it something else that we don't know yet?
The work that we've been doing now very much is going in that direction, that experience is actually affecting the strength of the connectivity. And importantly, so we have already published work looking at, for example, connectivity of the amygdala, part of the brain that is often associated with emotion and attention and so forth, and prefrontal cortex. And we've also looked at connectivity of the striatum, where you see reward processing, and also with prefrontal cortex. And what we find are decreases with development. So it's not always an increase. And what that could mean, we speculate, it could mean that with development, there is less influence, as you become an adult, of these reward systems to cognition. So cognition is remaining stable, but the influence of emotional and reward processing is attenuating with age. as, you know, the whole cognitive system is becoming more solidified.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah, that seems to jibe with the notion of bringing the reward system under control that you were bringing up before. So there's a question I kind of can't resist asking that was posted by one of our many questions that are kind of flying in here. So I'm just going to quote it directly, because from a parent's perspective, it appears that conflict and actively looking for conflict is a major driving force for cognitive development in adolescence. Why conflict? What is the benefit of learning by fighting? I'll let you handle it.
What an excellent question, by the way. So true. I do pity my poor mom when I was growing up. Again, what I was, you know, so for example, what I was saying before about the amygdala seeming to be more influential in this executive region, could kind of attest to the fact that the brain is testing its capability of integrating these systems, of engaging emotion to determine decision making, to determine how I'm exercising that cognitive aspect. But for that person who asked the question, who is a parent, I can tell you a little funny incident. So my son was acting in the fashion that I'm sure inspired that question. And I realized I'm not going to argue with them, because I realized that, you know, their emotional system is in control right now. I'll wait till the next day. And I approached him. I said, hey, look, you know, I hope you realize that the way that you reacted last night was completely out of line, and so forth. And he said, Mother, come on. Of all the people, you should know that my brain is not fully myelinated. And that's when I reminded him, that's true. You still, you know, that's not an excuse. But me calling you on this is going to assure that you get myelinated in the correct fashion. So a little bit of the take home is, and I tell parents this, that don't give up. Say what you have to say, preferably at a calm area, because the brain can't help but process the information that it's receiving. When they're not listening to you, it's still coming in, and it will influence, you know, the sorts of decisions that they make later. I mean, I remember arguing with my mother, telling me not to do X, Y, and Z. I remember thinking, no, that's not going to happen. And then eventually, yes, I was following in what I had heard, that had I not heard, I might have continued.
I mean, the volatility, one thing that the conflict question begs is, you know, the volatility of the time of adolescence, and the feeling of seeking it out, right? You know, one thing I know you've done is, and one thing that's fantastic about the area of science you have, is it's, as indicated in the question and answer rule that is sort of flying by us here, where people are wanting lots of questions. It's such an important, everyone gets what an important time it is. And that the consequences are starting to get really big of action. So you mentioned before that you were involved in sort of helping Supreme Court briefs think through how do you legislate about this. Can you tell us about that? What were the cases, or what was the context in which you were bringing this neuroscientific knowledge to bear? I mean, it's kind of a scientist's dream to be able to think you would, in some way, influence decision making at that level.
Yeah, no, that was a really amazing experience, because when you're informing non-scientific sources, especially in the realm of ethics, there has to be great responsibility in not overextending what neuroscience can say, especially when we're talking about fMRI studies and so forth. You know, we cannot say anything about the individual at this point, at that level that pertains to ethics and so forth. So when the American Medical Association lawyers first approached me, I was extremely careful, and I reached out to 10 of my closest developmental cognitive neuroscientists, and we wrote a letter that they could inform their brief with. And then subsequently, and these were for the cases of death of life without parole for a juvenile crime. So one was a non-homicide crime, and then subsequently we did homicide crimes to see about death without parole. And previous to both of these, there was the death penalty, where they talked a lot about my work. I wasn't involved in it, but because of that, they asked me later to be part of this. By the way, the United States was one of the only countries in the world that had the death penalty for juveniles. In any case, so we had to be very careful and really think about what can we say about an ethical question, which we really can't answer, and it's in another domain. So here are the type of things that we thought about and that I've informed these briefs with. Is number one, like we said before, if we think of issues that have to do with culpability, we do, and if you're asking me, is the adolescent brain the same as the adult brain, where we're trying to assess responsibility and we're trying to assess culpability and the motivations that went into a certain act? What we can say with some confidence is that, in fact, the adolescent brain is different in the way that I've been describing before, that they are more apt to drive their decision-making from emotions, from reward, and from peer influence, and to act in a more impulsive manner. And that's of importance when you're thinking about juvenile justice, because you are making a decision of a sentence for the rest of their life, when we are very much aware that the adolescent period is extremely short, and we are not able to say what that individual is going to turn out to be as an adult. I look at myself, there were many routes I could have taken, but here I am talking to you people today. So that was one very important point. The other very important point was that this is a period of heightened plasticity, as we have been discussing now, how environment and perhaps training can influence, so that the adolescent brain might be more amenable to rehabilitation than an adult brain. So again, this life without parole, putting a 14-year-old until they die in their 80s into, in prison, would not make that much sense. So we're very careful in trying to drive that discussion. And, in both cases, the justices did mention the fact that it was evident that the adolescent brain is still undergoing important changes, and that will not determine who that individual is. That said, I've given talks to law schools and so forth. We're not saying two very important things. We're not saying, number one, just slap their hands and make them go home, right? A crime, and some of these crimes that came up were horrific crimes, right? So it's really about trying to identify, if this is something that's so ingrained in them that they will not change, and maybe they do need to be in there forever, but we can't determine it at that time of sentencing at that age. And then another very important point that comes up is that there's the implication that what one is saying is that the adolescent is incapable of making a responsible decision. And that is not what we're trying to say. What we're trying to say is that in an explosive moment, in a heightened emotional moment, impulsivity can drive this poor decision-making that will be driven by emotions and perhaps violence, etc. But in a calm situation, so for example, when a teenage girl is, should she have the ability to make a decision about her body, pregnancy and so forth, it's not a volatile situation if you have someone sitting quietly with an adult, having a conversation without peers competing, without having enriched, demands to attention and to emotion and reward, that sort of decision making can emerge. And I'll just add one more point to that, giving talks to adolescent health doctors and so forth, this whole idea that you do have the ability to engage these cognitive systems in adolescence, many have come back to me and have told me that this has influenced how they deliver care to adolescents. So for example, one doctor told me that before this, they kept thinking, oh, well, adolescents with diabetes, they really can't take care of themselves. I'm really going to talk to the parent. I'm not going to engage them in their care because, they can't handle it. But now that they've seen, that there's evidence that they do have this capability, that now they're actually engaging adolescents in their own self-care while they're having a conversation in a quiet room, etc., and that's actually impacted how treatment can be delivered in adolescent youth.
I think that's a wonderful, we all hope that things that we do in the labs have impact in the world, but you really are giving us a great insight into that happening. And so it's so very important that policy and decision making is driven by science and data. So that was great. There are actually following on a little bit on the theme of teens engaging in risky behavior. I know that wasn't the complete entirety of what you were talking about, but perhaps somewhat linked. So why are teens, at least many teens, driven to engage in risky behavior? And you may have touched on this a little bit more generally in your introduction, but perhaps we could kind of loop back to that number of questions connected to that topic.
No, absolutely. And
yeah.
I talk a lot about risk-taking in my work. So risk-taking is the extreme expression of a very adaptive normative experience, which is sensation-seeking. And which also is underlined by information seeking. The seeking of new experiences, which is what this particular balance of higher reward than cognition is made to do. It's almost like the brain saying, okay, I gave you everything. Here's a little push, go and get new experiences. And within that very adaptive aspect of development, it can go all the way to risk-taking. So risk-taking is just an exaggerated aspect of it. In fact, this sensation-seeking is something that is present across cultures and societies, across species. There are rodent studies that show that pubertal rodents, those who go out farther away from the nest, which puts them in danger, end up being the ones that have greater survival skills than those who did not do that sort of exploration. So exploration is completely adaptive, and given circumstances, it can lend itself to doing risk-taking behavior because the brain is providing you a reward for new experiences. So, I want an even newer experience, and then, it can get into risk-taking behavior. But it's we believe, highly adaptive and necessary. And it doesn't, I remember I gave a talk once, and a girl came up to me and said, is there something wrong with me? I was never a risk taker when I was an adolescent. And I'm like, no, it's not just about that. It could be, it's information seeking, where you're a teenager, all of a sudden you're reading history books or science fiction is something that's outside of your wheelhouse and getting new experiences. So it's not all sex, drugs, rock and roll, and crime, but it can get to that level. But again, within this aspect of adaptive sensation seeking and information seeking.
And is there, thinking about the level of stimulus that's required to hit the reward, is it, you know, I think we all think back in listening to you about, again, thinking about extremes and the confrontation of being in those adolescent years and needing the music to be louder and everything has to be more intense. Is that because the teen brain requires a higher level of stimulus intensity to hit those reward pathways to feel satisfied?
That's a great question, because there's a lot of debate in the field there, and I think it's actually a little bit of both. So there is some work that's shown that perhaps during adolescence there's less rewards, so therefore you need greater stimulation to reach a normative level that would be for adulthood. But then there's a lot of work, including our own work, that shows that they actually have greater reward reactivity in these sorts of circumstances. So I think it depends a little bit in the circumstances. I'm always, I often wonder this whole thing about needing to have the music so loud, because I was one of those, and now it really bothers me. So I don't know if what's abnormal is me not liking it loud anymore, or if it's that. But I think, you know, they are in a stage of development where reward is so predominant that in order to sustain, I mean, if you had an easy way to sustain, you know, a feeling of great reward and maybe even euphoria, I would pump up the music, but it's not doing it for me anymore. So I don't know if that answers a little bit of your question.
Perfect.
Let me follow up also on the conflict question. It feels like one of the values of conflict here, and tell me if you think this is capturing what you were conveying before, Bea. To get to that point of exploration, there's almost has to be an inherent repellent. It's almost like a center surround receptive field for people for whom that makes sense. In other words, to want to go out further than the boundaries of what you know, there almost has to be a push away from what you do know. Push me, pull you, if you will. Like it's got to have that that repellent character to get teenagers to go out and have the experiences, as you're arguing, as you're stating, that they need to have to become fully formed grown-ups, right? Feels like those, in some sense, go together.
Yeah. I mean, there is there are many aspects to reward, punishment, positive emotion, and negative emotion that we're trying to understand. So we have a paper under review now where we found something really interesting, which was that, for example, negative emotions, when we asked them to rate it, adults understood very well that negative emotions produce greater arousal. But adolescents were like, nah, doesn't bother me. But then we saw that their reactivity was still high. So there's a lack of awareness of their negative emotionality that might still influence their brain, but they don't have that conscious aspect to it. So I can see a push and pull there. And then whatever is rewarding is like a push to go and get things. And then when you look at punishment and reward, there are very different circuitries that are involved in that, as it is different emotional aspects that are involved in both reward and in punishment. And yeah, there must be a center surround push-pull aspect to that, you know, calibrates itself as you become an adult to find what your particular plus and minuses are going to be, because there's so much individual variability in that.
Right. Yeah. One a version of questions that is coming in a variety of forms, and I think things you're saying has touched on it, but it's good to pose it in a very specific way. I'll quote from one. What should current adolescents do with this information about their brains? Is there any way we change this or build a stronger brain? Some people have been asking about, is there a way college students could take advantage of aspects of the plasticity ongoing to benefit themselves. But what should current adolescents do with this information? I'm assuming that is coming from a current adolescent based on the way it's phrased.
That's great. Well, I have a couple of things to say about that. Okay, one thing I'll say, so I was involved in a report written by the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, about adolescents having a more prolonged stage in Western societies like the United States, so that adolescence is persisting into 25. And that stirred up a lot of controversy. Oh, these kids, we let them be adolescents for so long. And again, my response to that is that we have the luxury of supporting a prolonged adolescence, a prolonged period of specialization. For example, getting a PhD, going to medical school or whatever, or your parents paying for your phone plan, you know. And you know, it's protective so that they can do this information seeking exploration, and then they can end up finding what they really want to do, marrying the person they really want to marry, etc. So it's a prolonged period, because you were talking about, you know, college students, and it is appropriate. What can they do? So what comes to mind, so I'm originally from Chile, and I was invited there last year, and they did something so amazing. It's fronted and led by graduate students in the neuroscience department and medical school. They started a whole program that is about the adolescent brain. So through Instagram and Twitter and so forth, they give information to adolescents about their own brain, about what they're experiencing. You know, so you're feeling depressed, you think it's the end of the world, that's normal. That you feel that way, that happens a lot at this time of your life, and it really has to do with aspects of your brain. Why don't you try doing this or doing that? And they have a million different questions, you know, different things that they put out about sex, about drugs, and everything within the context of neuroscience and the brain. So a lot of information that's there, and they're extremely receptive to it. As part of my tour that I did for this this initiative, I had to give a talk to, you know, like a whole school of adolescents, and I was very impressed by their attention and by the nature of their questions, that they really are wondering what's going on with me. And I think that they are capable, like I said before, I mean, I think a lot of people think they're not, but they are capable of receiving this type of information. That's not going to stop them from having experiences, because that's the nature of being an adolescent, but they'll be better informed. So for example, with my own kids when they were teenagers, my approach, and doesn't have to be what other people's approaches is, was not like, if you ever drink or do drugs, don't ever talk to me again, you're not allowed in this house. That's absolutely not. I just assumed they're going to be in that situation. So my idea was to inform them, and to inform them about contraception and all of these things very early on, because I don't know where they're going to be, at what situation. I want them to be equipped with that knowledge so they can engage that cognitive system and make the best decision possible. And I always, you know, we had an open door policy. It doesn't matter what you do, we will be there for you. You can call us at 3 a.m. to pick you up from a party where there have been drinking. There will be no questions asked. You know, so that they know that they have the support, but empower them with knowledge. And the same with adolescents. A lot of undergrads are coming to college having their first experiences ever in sensation seeking, and they're taking it too far without sufficient knowledge. So I think knowledge, experience, and knowing that they have support systems.
I think that you know, is probably a good place to kind of move into a number of questions that have to do with how can one exert control over behavior. And so you mentioned this wonderful approach to guiding and always being there. There are other questions about, what can I do? One came in, actually, it was really interesting, around sleep, and the very different kind of circadian rhythm that certainly I remember being in when I was a teenager. And we know, of course, that sleep deprivation is a pretty fast way to a psychotic break, and or at least some form of it. So what are your thoughts about the very strong epidemiological evidence that sleep duration is associated with increased risk-taking in adolescents? And is this a form, or is this something that we can all think about assisting with, or for teens to have control over at some level? Getting enough sleep. I can't remember how many times I heard that, but it really didn't follow that advice much.
No, that's a very important topic that many are looking into. We're looking into it as well, and so forth. And here I'll give you my thoughts about it, based on what I know in the literature and so forth, is that the reactivity that they have to sleep deprivation is not necessarily different from what you would have as an adult. It's just that they have more sleep deprivation. So for example, one battle that I just don't understand why it hasn't been solved yet is the early school times. Because they do have this inherent, and I don't know the mechanisms underlying this inherent want to stay up as long as they can. Maybe it's within that whole nature of information gathering and more experiences. They don't want to stop because they're so hyped up with their reward sensitivities. But having to get up, my daughter, I remember, would have to get up at 5 in the morning to go to school. So of course they're sleep deprived. Of course they're going to be on edge emotionally, but also, academically, that could be a problem. Now, you use this word that I swear it does make me laugh. The word control. I think that in many ways, we kind of have to give up that aspect of parenting during that time, or at least do it in a very indirect manner, because I think this whole aspect of sensation seeking, reward processing, is very much against control. It's really about them learning their own control. So it's really, again, about equipping them to make the decisions that are going to be beneficial to them. Trying to make them make that is going to be way more difficult, especially when they are sleep deprived. If they're in a situation where they can, make their own decisions, even about sleep, that would be better. That said, I wouldn't say, hey, go party until 3 in the morning on a school night. I think some regulations that were established early on in development, can make sense. And again, providing knowledge to them is also of importance.
Let me grab another theme that's really present in the questions. And you touched on it a little bit with the social media, and the hope that adolescents are not as socially isolated because they're more used to communicating on social media. But, given this just historic time that we're in with the COVID-19 disease right now, can you talk about, what are some of the impacts on the adolescent brain of the social distancing, the general context of this? There's even an existential piece probably to it. Can you just reflect on that some?
No, absolutely.
Your expertise in this.
I'm part of a project called ABCD, Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development, where we're following 11,000 teenagers across the United States in 20 different sites, etc. And of course, we have jumped on the bandwagon and we're sending COVID assessments to try to understand what the impact is. And we've had some really interesting discussions because I think predominantly the focus is, the presumption is this social isolation, the lack of going to school and being with peers is going to be negative, it'll be detrimental, and it'll cause anxiety and stress. That can very well be the case, but maybe because I'm a positive person, I tend to think that maybe there might be some beneficial aspects to this as well. And again, with that whole idea that they are adaptive, that this might, that they have these social networks already established. It might be a bigger stressor for parents. I see that already in many different ways, every Zoom meeting that I have. And it's funny, I'll have these Zoom meetings and in the background, I'll see a teenager, happy as can be, running around with their iPad, doing their thing, feeling some sort of freedom. So it may not all be as negative as we think it is. The data will show us what the impact is, but I'm leaning more towards, we might see some interesting benefits, and like you said, even existentially, being removed from all the commotion and the stressors of being in school and the bullying and the peer pressures, and having some distance. It may not all be bad, is what I'm thinking. And it could provide an opportunity. I don't know. I guess it could go either way with parents. And in fact, I made sure that we asked questions that had to do, is your relationship better, worse, the same with your parents? Are you talking more or less, or the same with your parents, with your friends, and so forth?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That, to me, that felt like about 5 minutes. I don't know how an hour just went by.
Yeah.
It was tremendous. Wonderful conversation, and a good amount of science, a little bit of speculation, but a really important and interesting topic, because we were all adolescents at one point, and others who are listening to it are right there, right in that moment.
Yeah,
it's actually a really fun place to be. So
yeah.
I want to thank you both, particularly Bea, for just such a stimulating conversation. As I said, it was just fun, flowed well. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. We, as you can tell, Chris and I feed off of your really good ideas. We're just here to read them out. So thank you. That was tremendous. We talked a little bit about decision making in adolescence, and touched on the propensity for risk-taking behavior, and that is certainly one of the big tragedies, of our time. If one thinks about addiction and the impact of addiction on the whole society, but in particular, of course, that long-lasting impact on adolescents. And so that actually links to our conversation next week with our wonderful colleague, Dr. Carla Cowan, who's the Carney Assistant Professor of Neuroscience. And she'll be with us in discussion on May the 18th from 4 to 5, talking with Chris and I on what can drunk flies tell us about addiction. So thank you again. This was wonderful. Thanks to Bea. We'll see you next week.